The spring of 1848, somewhere in the Canadian Arctic, a man stumbled across the ice. His name was Lieutenant Graham Gore, and he was about to leave behind one of history's most haunting messages. On a cairn of stones, he placed a simple document, a standard naval form. It contained routine information, position, date, the fact that all was well. But when another expedition found that same document 11 months later, someone had scrawled a desperate addition in the margins. Sir John Franklin died. Total loss of life, 105 souls. 129 men had sailed into the Arctic. None would return alive. This is the story of the Franklin expedition, the most disastrous voyage in the history of Arctic exploration. It's a tale of ambition and miscalculation, of modern technology failing against ancient ice, and of men who believed they were invincible discovering just how fragile human life truly is. Sir John Franklin was 59 years old when he accepted command of the expedition. To many, he seemed too old for such a dangerous mission. He was overweight, balding, and had a reputation for being somewhat indecisive. But Franklin was also a veteran of Arctic exploration, a man who had survived being shipwrecked, starved, and frozen on previous expeditions. The British Admiralty believed he was the perfect choice to finally solve one of the great geographical puzzles of the age. Finding the Northwest Passage. The Northwest Passage was a sea route through the Arctic that would connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. For centuries, European powers had searched for this shortcut to Asia. Dozens of expeditions had tried and failed. Some had vanished without a trace. But by 1845, only a small section remained uncharted. The Admiralty was convinced that this final gap could be crossed, that the passage could finally be conquered. They were determined that Britain would claim the glory. Franklin's expedition was to be the most advanced, best-equipped Arctic mission ever mounted. The Admiralty spared no expense. They chose 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. These weren't ordinary vessels, they were bomb ships, built to withstand the recoil of heavy mortars. Their hulls were reinforced with layers of African oak and Canadian elm. They were fitted with steam engines that could drive retractable propellers, giving them power independent of wind and sail. The ships were equipped with central heating systems, libraries containing over 1,200 books, and even an early form of distilled water system. Provisions were equally impressive. The expedition carried enough food to last 3 years, 29,000 pounds of canned meat, 33,000 pounds of preserved vegetables, tons of flour, chocolate, tea, and tobacco. They brought wine, rum, and lemon juice to prevent scurvy. They even packed engraved silverware and fine china. This was to be a civilized expedition, a demonstration of British superiority over the savage Arctic wilderness. On May 19, 1845, Franklin's ships departed from Greenhithe, England. Church bells rang. Crowds cheered from the docks. Families waved goodbye to fathers, sons, and brothers. The crew numbered 129 men, officers, sailors, engineers, and an ice master who specialized in navigating frozen seas. They were confident, well-trained, and completely unprepared for what awaited them. The ships sailed north, stopping briefly in Scotland and then Greenland to take on final supplies and send home their last letters. In late July, they were spotted by a whaling ship in Baffin Bay, anchored to an iceberg while waiting for conditions to improve. The whalers reported that Franklin and his men seemed in good spirits. They were ready to push westward into the unknown. And then, they vanished. For nearly 2 years, nothing was heard from the Franklin expedition. Back in England, this wasn't immediately alarming. Arctic expeditions often lost contact for extended periods. But as 1847 turned to 1848, concern grew. Lady Franklin, Sir John's wife, began lobbying the Admiralty to send search parties. The British public, gripped by the mystery, demanded action. What no one knew, what no one could have imagined, was that both ships were already trapped. Locked in ice that would never release them. And the men, despite all their provisions and preparations, were already beginning to die. The ice came in September 1846. Not gradually, but suddenly, great sheets of it grinding together, locking the ships in place somewhere northwest of King William Island. Franklin's men would have watched from the decks as their escape route vanished, replaced by an endless white prison. They had sailed into a channel that would later be identified as one of the most ice-choked passages in the entire Arctic. It was a trap that would hold them for nearly 2 years. But initially, this wasn't cause for panic. Ships becoming frozen in Arctic ice was expected, almost routine. Both Erebus and Terror had been designed for precisely this scenario. The crews settled in for winter, converting their vessels into floating houses. They hung canvas over the decks to create covered walkways. The steam heating systems kept the interior spaces relatively warm. Officers continued their scientific observations. Measuring temperatures, recording magnetic readings, collecting specimens. The men played cards, put on theatrical performances, and read from their extensive library. They believed they were simply waiting out the winter before the spring thaw would free them. What they didn't realize was that they had entered during an unusually cold period. Climate records would later show that the late 1840s marked one of the coldest phases of the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long cooling period. The ice that imprisoned their ships wasn't going to melt in spring. It wasn't going to melt the following spring either. The Northwest Passage they sought had, in those particular years, effectively ceased to exist. Sir John Franklin likely spent that first winter confident in his command. He had survived worse conditions before. The ships were sound. The men were healthy. The provisions would last for years. He probably worked on his charts and reports, preparing the triumphant account he would deliver to the Admiralty when they finally broke free and completed the passage. He was, after all, on the verge of solving one of the greatest mysteries of the age. But sometime during that first winter, or perhaps in the brief Arctic summer of 1847, Sir John Franklin died. The historical record tells us only that he died on June 11, 1847, aboard HMS Erebus. The cause remains unknown. He was 51 years old, or rather, 59, but the Arctic had a way of aging men rapidly. Some historians speculate it was a heart attack or stroke, conditions his age and weight made likely. Others suggest pneumonia, tuberculosis, or some other illness that the ship's surgeon couldn't treat in those isolated conditions. Whatever killed Franklin, his death marked a crucial turning point. Command passed to Captain Francis Crozier of HMS Terror, an experienced Arctic hand who understood the ice far better than Franklin had. But Crozier inherited an increasingly dire situation. The summer of 1847 came and went without freeing the ships. The ice barely loosened. And now, subtle signs of trouble were beginning to appear among the crew. The first symptoms would have been easy to dismiss. Fatigue. Weakness. Irritability. Some men complained of strange pains in their limbs. Others developed spots on their skin or found their gums beginning to swell and bleed. The ship's surgeons, Stephen Stanley on Erebus and Alexander MacDonald on Terror, would have recognized these as potential signs of scurvy, the vitamin C deficiency that had plagued sailors for centuries. But that seemed impossible. The expedition carried tons of preserved vegetables and lemon juice specifically to prevent scurvy. What neither the surgeons nor anyone else understood was that their food was killing them. The expedition's provisions had been supplied by a contractor named Stephen Goldner, who had won the contract by submitting an impossibly low bid. To fulfill his commitment, Goldner had cut corners. The canning process had been rushed. Many tins were improperly sealed. But most catastrophically, the tins were soldered with lead. And not just a thin line of it, but thick, sloppy beads of lead solder that came into direct contact with the food inside. Lead poisoning is insidious. It accumulates in the body slowly. It affects the brain, causing confusion, irritability, and impaired judgment. It damages the nervous system, causing weakness and pain. It depresses the immune system, making victims vulnerable to infections. And the men of the Franklin expedition were consuming lead with every meal, 3 times a day, for months on end. They were being poisoned by the very supplies meant to keep them alive. By the time the second winter set in, the winter of 1847 to 1848, the situation aboard the ships had deteriorated significantly. More men were falling ill. The cold was relentless, dropping to temperatures where exposed skin could freeze in minutes. Fuel for heating was being rationed. The monotony of confinement was wearing on morale. And perhaps worst of all, it was becoming clear that the ice wasn't going to release them. The psychological weight of this impending return is crushing. Imagine tasting freedom, real freedom, and then being told you must voluntarily return to prison. Imagine finding love, respect, and happiness, and then boarding a ship commanded by a man who views you with contempt. For men who've been brutalized by naval discipline, who've endured poverty and powerlessness their entire lives, Tahiti represents everything the British Empire is not. Generous instead of exploitative, warm instead of cold, accepting instead of judgmental. On April 4, 1789, the Bounty finally departs Tahiti. The ship is loaded with over 1,000 breadfruit plants, carefully tended in pots that fill the deck and below. The crew lines the rails, watching the island recede into the distance. Some men are openly weeping. Others stand in silence, their faces blank with loss. Fletcher Christian stands among them, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the disappearing shore where Mawachua stands watching the ship sail away. Bligh, for his part, seems relieved to be underway. His mission is nearly complete. All he has to do is deliver these plants to the West Indies, and his reputation will be secured. He doesn't notice, or doesn't care, that his crew is heartbroken. On April 22, 1848, a group of officers made their way across the ice to a stone cairn on the northern shore of King William Island. They were about to leave behind the only surviving written record of what had happened to the Franklin expedition. Lieutenant Graham Gore had visited this same spot nearly a year earlier, depositing a standard form that cheerfully reported all was well. Now, different hands lifted that document and added new words in the margins. The message was devastating in its brevity. Sir John Franklin had died on June 11, 1847. Total losses to date, 9 officers and 15 men, 24 souls gone. The ships had been locked in ice since September 12, 1846. And then, the most ominous line, and start on tomorrow, 26th, for Back's Fish River. They were abandoning the ships. 105 men were about to attempt a journey of over 600 miles on foot, hauling everything they would need to survive across the Arctic. Captain Crozier and Captain James Fitzjames, who had taken command of Erebus after Franklin's death, signed the document. Then they sealed it in a canister and left it in the cairn, perhaps hoping that someday, someone would find it and know what had become of them. The decision to abandon ship represented a complete breakdown of the original plan. Everything the expedition had been designed for, the reinforced hulls, the steam engines, the years of provisions, now meant nothing. The men were leaving behind shelter, the bulk of their supplies, and any hope of rescue finding them at a known location. But Crozier must have calculated that staying meant certain death. At least by moving, they had a chance, however slim, of reaching the Hudson's Bay Company post at the mouth of the Back River, where they might find help or at least game to hunt. What followed was one of the most horrific death marches in exploration history. The men hauled boats mounted on sledges, each weighing over 1,000 pounds. In their weakened state, poisoned by lead, ravaged by scurvy, malnourished despite the provisions they carried, the physical effort was monumental. They moved in groups, establishing camps, then returning for more supplies, covering the same ground multiple times. The Arctic spring offered no relief, temperatures remained brutally cold, storms swept across the exposed ice, and the landscape provided no food, no shelter, no comfort of any kind. The archaeological evidence discovered decades later paints a disturbing picture of their priorities and their deteriorating judgment. The boats they hauled contained bizarre assortments of items: silver plate and cutlery, silk handkerchiefs, books, soap, slippers, and even a backgammon board. These were the trappings of Victorian civilization, utterly useless for survival but apparently impossible for the men to leave behind. The lead poisoning affecting their brains may have impaired their decision-making, causing them to cling irrationally to the familiar comforts of their former lives. They also carried guns and ammunition, but the evidence suggests they were largely unsuccessful at hunting. The Arctic in spring offered seals and occasional caribou, resources that Inuit peoples had survived on for millennia. But Franklin's men were Royal Navy sailors, not hunters. They didn't know how to read the ice for seal breathing holes, how to track caribou across the tundra, or how to build the snow shelters that would have provided better protection than their canvas tents. They were civilized men trying to survive in a wilderness that demanded entirely different skills. As they struggled south, the men began to die. First in ones and twos, then in greater numbers. Some simply collapsed from exhaustion and never rose again. Others succumbed to scurvy, their bodies breaking down from the inside as their connective tissue dissolved. The lead poisoning caused confusion, paralysis, and organ failure. Pneumonia and tuberculosis, thriving in their weakened bodies, claimed more victims. The dead were left where they fell, there was neither time nor strength to provide proper burials. Inuit oral histories, collected decades later, provide glimpses of the expedition's final days. Hunters reported seeing groups of white men, gaunt and desperate, hauling boats across the ice. Some were described as walking like children, staggering and confused, symptoms consistent with severe lead poisoning affecting the nervous system. The Inuit offered help in some cases, but the language barrier and the deteriorated mental state of Franklin's men made communication nearly impossible. Some Franklin crew members allegedly indicated through gestures that their ships had been crushed by ice. Though this wasn't accurate, both vessels remained intact for years after abandonment. The most disturbing evidence emerged later, when search parties and archaeologists found human remains showing unmistakable signs of cannibalism. Bones had been broken open to extract marrow. Skulls showed marks consistent with defleshing. This wasn't the result of violence between crew members, but rather the desperate final act of starving men trying to survive by any means necessary. The Victorian public, when rumors of cannibalism first surfaced, reacted with horror and denial. British naval officers, they insisted, would never resort to such savagery. But the physical evidence was irrefutable. The men split into smaller groups as the march continued, perhaps hoping that dispersal would increase their chances of survival, or perhaps because cohesion simply broke down as command structure collapsed. Some headed inland toward the Back River. Others turned back north, possibly hoping to return to the ships or find help. A few made it surprisingly far. Human remains have been found scattered across hundreds of miles of Arctic terrain, suggesting that some men survived for weeks or even months after abandonment. But none survived long enough to reach safety. The last of Franklin's men likely died sometime in 1849 or possibly early 1850, though the exact timeline remains uncertain. 105 men had set out from the ships. All of them perished on the ice and rock of King William Island and the surrounding territories. They left behind scattered campsites, abandoned equipment, and bones that would puzzle investigators for more than a century. Back in England, none of this was yet known. Lady Franklin continued her tireless campaign for rescue expeditions. The Admiralty, finally acknowledging that something had gone terribly wrong, began organizing search parties. Dozens of ships would eventually be sent to find Franklin and his men, scouring the Arctic from multiple directions. These searches would, ironically, accomplish what Franklin's expedition had set out to do. They would finally chart the Northwest Passage, filling in the gaps in Arctic geography. But they would find no survivors. Only clues. Only questions. And only the slow, horrifying realization that Britain's most advanced Arctic expedition had ended in complete catastrophe, with every single member of the crew dead in the most brutal conditions imaginable. The mystery of exactly what happened, and where the ships themselves had disappeared to, would haunt the Arctic for another century and a half. By 1848, London was gripped by Franklin fever. Lady Jane Franklin, refusing to accept that her husband might be dead, had become a formidable force. She wrote letters to the Admiralty, met with politicians, granted newspaper interviews, and appealed to the public. She offered rewards from her own fortune for information about the expedition. The British press, sensing a compelling story, amplified her campaign. Questions were asked in Parliament. How could Britain's most advanced Arctic expedition simply vanish? Where were the ships? Where were the men? The Admiralty, initially reluctant to acknowledge failure, finally authorized the first rescue missions in 1848. What followed became the largest search operation in polar history. Over the next decade, more than 30 expeditions would venture into the Arctic looking for Franklin. Ships approached from both the Atlantic and Pacific sides. They searched inlets, mapped coastlines, left supply caches, and deposited messages in cairns. The irony was profound. The mission to find the Northwest Passage had failed catastrophically, but the search for that failed mission was finally revealing the passage's secrets. The first breakthrough came in August 1850 when Captain Erasmus Omni, commanding HMS Assistance, discovered traces of the expedition on Beechey Island. The site was eerie: remains of a blacksmith's forge, fragments of naval equipment, scraps of cloth, and most significantly, 3 graves. The headstones bore the names of John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Braine, all members of Franklin's crew who had died in early 1846, during that first winter. The graves proved Franklin had been in the area, but they offered no clue about where he had gone next or what had befallen the expedition. Those graves would keep their secrets for another 130 years, until forensic scientists exhumed the bodies in the 1980s and discovered the shocking truth about lead poisoning. But in 1850, they merely deepened the mystery. Other search expeditions found scattered evidence. Captain Robert McClure, approaching from the Pacific, discovered the western entrance to the passage Franklin had sought but found no trace of the expedition itself. Ships became trapped in ice, forcing rescues of the rescuers. Men died searching for men who were already dead. The Arctic seemed determined to keep its secrets, revealing only tantalizing fragments that raised more questions than they answered. Then, in 1854, a Hudson's Bay Company explorer named John Ray returned from the Arctic with devastating news. He had met Inuit hunters near Pelly Bay who possessed items that had clearly come from Franklin's expedition: silver plates engraved with officers' initials, gold watches, naval buttons, and fragments of uniforms. Through interpreters, the Inuit told Ray a disturbing story. They had seen approximately 40 white men, dragging a boat and sledges, heading south several years earlier. The men were thin, exhausted, and clearly in distress. Later, the Inuit had found bodies and evidence of the expedition's fate. And then Ray reported the detail that would scandalize Victorian Britain: the Inuit testimony suggested cannibalism. Bodies had been found with flesh stripped from bones, skulls broken open, limbs dismembered in ways that indicated the men had fed upon their dead companions. The British public reacted with fury and denial. Charles Dickens, among others, published articles viciously attacking the Inuit testimony, arguing that noble British officers would never resort to such savagery. The racism of the era made it easy to dismiss Indigenous witnesses as unreliable or malicious. But Ray had brought back physical evidence, items that could only have come from the expedition. The Admiralty, faced with this evidence, officially declared Franklin and his men dead in 1854. Lady Franklin refused to accept defeat. She organized and funded her own search expedition in 1857, commanded by Captain Francis Leopold McClintock aboard the yacht Fox. This mission would finally provide concrete answers. In May 1859, McClintock's men discovered the note left in the cairn on King William Island, the message describing Franklin's death and the decision to abandon ship. They found a boat mounted on a sledge containing the remains of two men surrounded by that bizarre collection of items, silverware, silk, books, and soap, but precious little actual food. McClintock's expedition also collected extensive testimony from Inuit communities. The stories were consistent: white men had been seen struggling south, ships had been abandoned in the ice, bodies and artifacts had been found scattered across a wide area. One Inuit woman told McClintock about a ship that had sunk in deep water. Another group described seeing a ship trapped in ice with one man dead inside. These accounts suggested that at least one of Franklin's ships might have drifted for years after being abandoned, perhaps even with a few crew members still aboard. The physical evidence McClintock gathered painted a picture of complete disaster. Skeletons were found scattered along the routes the men had taken. Most remained unburied, picked clean by Arctic foxes and weather. Personal items, combs, prayer books, letters, lay beside the bones, final possessions of men who had died alone in the wilderness. One skeleton was found with a pocketbook containing a few pounds sterling, utterly useless in the Arctic but apparently too precious to abandon. McClintock returned to England with his findings in 1859. The mystery of what had happened to Franklin was essentially solved, at least in broad strokes. The ships had become trapped, Franklin had died, the men had abandoned the vessels and perished attempting to reach safety. The search expeditions were wound down. Franklin was memorialized as a hero who had died in service to exploration and empire. A monument was erected in Westminster Abbey. Lady Franklin, though heartbroken, took some comfort in knowing her husband's fate. But two enormous questions remained unanswered, and they would haunt Arctic researchers for the next 150 years. Where exactly had the ships been trapped? And where were the wrecks of HMS Erebus and Terror? The Inuit oral history suggested the ships hadn't been crushed by ice as some survivors had indicated. They had survived, at least for a time. Some accounts described a ship with masts still standing, trapped far from where it should have been. Other stories told of ships sinking in deep channels. The testimonies were fragmentary, passed down through generations, mixed with other stories and legends. But they persisted, suggesting that somewhere beneath the Arctic waters, two of history's most famous ships lay preserved in the cold. Numerous expeditions searched for the wrecks over the following century. Divers explored likely locations. Side-scan sonar swept across suspected areas. Aircraft flew search patterns over the ice. But the Arctic is vast, the underwater visibility is poor, and the ice constantly shifts, revealing and concealing in equal measure. Year after year, the ships remained hidden. Until finally, in the 21st century, technology and determination caught up with the mystery. The lost ships of the Franklin expedition were about to be found, and with them, new answers to old questions, along with entirely new mysteries that no one had anticipated. For over 160 years, HMS Erebus and Terror had been ghosts. They existed in historical records, in Inuit oral traditions, in the imaginations of historians and explorers. Dozens of expeditions had searched for them. Millions of dollars had been spent combing the Arctic seabed. The wrecks had become maritime archaeology's holy grail, two perfectly preserved time capsules from the Victorian era, lying somewhere in the cold, dark waters of the Canadian Arctic. The breakthrough came not from technology alone, but from finally listening to the people who had known the truth all along. For generations, Inuit communities had maintained detailed oral histories about the Franklin expedition. Elders told stories passed down from their ancestors about ships trapped in ice, about where they had been seen, about items recovered from the vessels. Western searchers had often dismissed these accounts as unreliable or vague. But when Parks Canada archaeologist Ryan Harris and his team began their renewed search in the 2000s, they took a different approach. They treated Inuit knowledge as primary evidence. Louis Kamukak, an Inuit historian from GJOA Haven, had spent decades collecting and documenting oral histories about Franklin. He knew the stories intimately, which families had found artifacts, where ships had been spotted, where bodies had been discovered. His research, combined with modern sonar technology, finally provided the breakthrough searchers had sought for over a century and a half. On September 1, 2014, a remotely operated underwater vehicle deployed from the Canadian research vessel Martin Bergman captured images that made headlines around the world. There, lying in only 11 meters of water in Wilmot and Crampton Bay near King William Island, was HMS Erebus. The ship sat upright on the seafloor, remarkably intact. Her masts were gone, probably sheared off by ice, but the hull remained in extraordinary condition. The cold Arctic water had preserved her wood. Through the murky footage, researchers could make out the ship's deck structures, and the distinctive reinforced bow that had been designed to resist ice pressure. The discovery was electrifying. After 169 years, one of the most famous lost ships in history had been found. But where was Terror? Inuit testimony suggested the two ships had separated, that they had ended up in different locations. The search continued. 2 years later, on September 3, 2016, the Arctic Research Foundation's vessel Martin Bergman was searching Terror Bay, an area named decades earlier based on Inuit reports of a ship in that vicinity. A remotely operated vehicle descended into the dark waters and, at a depth of 24 meters, found HMS Terror. Like her sister ship, she sat upright and remarkably intact. Her hatches were closed. Her hull showed no signs of catastrophic damage. She looked almost as if she could still sail. The discoveries rewrote what historians thought they knew about the expedition's final chapter. Terror had been found 96 kilometers south of where the ships had reportedly been abandoned. That's an enormous distance for an unmanned vessel to drift, or was she unmanned? The closed hatches suggested purpose, not abandonment. Some researchers now theorize that a few crew members might have returned to one or both ships after the initial evacuation, attempting to sail them to safety. Perhaps some men had realized that abandoning ship had been a fatal mistake and tried to correct it. Subsequent diving expeditions revealed astonishing details. Inside Erebus, cameras captured images of tables still set with plates and glasses, storage areas containing bottles and containers, the ship's bell perfectly preserved. Artifacts recovered included dishes with officers' names, buttons, writing slates, and even a leather boot. On Terror, divers found drawers still closed in the officers' cabins, suggesting that when the ship finally sank, it had happened relatively quickly, a slow flooding rather than a violent destruction. The ships offered tantalizing new evidence but also new mysteries. Why was Terror so far from where the expedition had reportedly been trapped? How long had the ships remained afloat after abandonment? Had anyone been aboard when they finally sank? The wrecks themselves were preserved crime scenes from history, frozen in time, waiting to reveal their secrets. Modern forensic analysis of remains found in the 1980s and 1990s finally confirmed what had killed Franklin's men. The lead poisoning was severe, bone samples showed concentrations up to 10 times normal levels. The contaminated food had been slowly destroying their bodies and minds from the very beginning. Combined with scurvy, exposure, and starvation, the men had faced a perfect storm of lethal conditions. Even if they had successfully hunted game or received help from Inuit communities, many were already too poisoned to recover. The expeditions also vindicated the Inuit testimony. Every major claim made by Indigenous witnesses over the decades had been proven accurate. The ships had survived for years after abandonment. They had drifted or been sailed to locations far from where they'd been trapped. Men had died along the routes the Inuit had described. Artifacts had been found exactly where Indigenous peoples said they would be. For over a century, Western searchers had often dismissed this knowledge. The discovery of the ships proved that the answers had been available all along, if only anyone had truly listened. Today, both wrecks are protected as National Historic Sites. Canadian law prohibits unauthorized diving or artifact removal. Archaeologists continue to study the sites using non-invasive techniques, documenting everything while disturbing as little as possible. The ships are cultural monuments, not treasure troves to be plundered. They represent not just a failed expedition, but a turning point in how we understand Arctic history and the value of indigenous knowledge. The Franklin expedition's legacy extends far beyond the tragedy itself. The search for Franklin opened up the Arctic, proved that the Northwest Passage existed, though it would remain impassable to commercial shipping for over a century. The expedition demonstrated the limits of Victorian-era technology and the deadly consequences of ignoring indigenous knowledge and traditional survival skills. It showed that civilization's tools, steam engines, canned food, Victorian propriety, could become liabilities rather than advantages in extreme environments. Climate change has added a bitter coda to the story. The Northwest Passage that trapped and killed Franklin's men is now increasingly ice-free during summer months. Ships regularly traverse routes that were suicide missions in 1845. The Arctic that preserved the Franklin wrecks for 170 years is warming rapidly, threatening the very sites that have given us new understanding of the expedition's fate. In the end, 129 men sailed into the Arctic seeking glory and geographic knowledge. All of them died in conditions of unimaginable hardship. But their story didn't end with their deaths. It continued through decades of searches, through the preservation of their ships in cold dark water, through the faithful keeping of oral histories by Inuit communities, and finally through modern technology revealing what had remained hidden for so long. The Franklin expedition became a haunting reminder that nature is indifferent to human ambition, that the most advanced technology can fail against ancient forces, and that sometimes, the greatest discoveries come not from conquest, but from catastrophe. The lost expedition found what it sought, the Northwest Passage did exist. But the price of that discovery was written in frozen graves, scattered bones, and 2 ships resting silently on the Arctic seafloor, monuments to both human courage and human hubris.